Okay, so I guess let's go ahead and get started. Yep. Come on in and join the fun. It looks like we're going to have a relatively full house. So we still have some seats up front with power. Thank you for joining us for our session today, in which we're going to be focusing on sustainability of repositories and repository networks, as this is a continuing challenge for our community, and we've been able to bring together a number of motivating case studies that we'll be hearing about, and then transitioning into a conversation where we're going to try to tap the collective wisdom of our ESIP community in identifying some steps forward. I'm Carl Benedict. I'm from the University of New Mexico, and one of the cast of thousands that are helping organize and contribute to this session. We'll be introducing our individual speakers as they're doing their presentations. But yes, thank you for coming. And what we're going to be doing today, as I said, if I can advance my slides. There we go. Again, we're really here trying to focus on sustainability. And one of the questions that we want to try to answer is actually, what do we mean by sustainability? As each of us brings probably some different values and perspectives on what repositories mean to us, what networks of repositories mean to us, what values they bring, and as a result, what are the characteristics of those repositories and networks that are important to sustain. As I said, we're going to be starting with some motivating case studies. We're then going to have a facilitated discussion and then finish with a conversation about how we can move forward in trying to actually move towards a sustainable collection of repositories and networks to support our community. I will ask you, whether you're online or in the room, to open up our shared notes page in the Google Doc there, and go ahead and provide, to the extent you'd like, your contact information and coordinates. And also, one of the key items that we'd also like to hear from you is what stakeholder community you probably find yourself bringing into the conversation. Are you a repository manager? Are you a software developer? Are you a data provider or user? As I mentioned a moment ago, each one of those examples of stakeholder communities bring different perspectives to how we approach the idea and value sustainability of our repository collections. There will be another link to the shared notes when we get to the end of my introduction here, but this would be a good chance to open up that notes document and also contribute to our shared notes through the discussion. So I've already mentioned what we're trying to do today, but we really are asking all of you to actively participate and find and represent your voice in this conversation. Bringing your perspective as a member of one or more stakeholder communities that interacts with repositories and networks, to give some thought. And this is actually one of the purposes of the introductory case studies that we're going to be having presented at the beginning of this, as a way to give some thought to what you see as the value and contributions of the repositories and networks that you interact with or that you would like to interact with, and what about those are the things that you would like to see sustained. Is it the technical infrastructure? Is it the collections themselves? Is it the community around those repositories? Those are just examples of some of the things that we can think and talk about when it comes to the value and impact of repositories for the different users. And then finally, opening up the conversation with, something that a colleague of mine has described as sort of the magic wand exercise. If you could do one thing to enable your concept of sustainability, what would it be? As we're having our discussion, please keep that in the back of your mind in terms of how you might select an activity or an action that would lead to sustainability as it's meaningful to you. So with that, as we do want to maximize our discussion time, we want to go ahead and get started with our case study presentations. And again, here is the link to our shared notes document. We've asked each of our presenters to bring in essentially their experience, either with the repositories that they're responsible for or the responsibilities that they've interacted in through research and other activities. So I think we're going to have an opportunity to have a nice varied set of case studies to be able to frame our conversation, and then we can move on to our discussion. And before I start, are there any questions before I ask Steve to come up and talk about his work with Dryad? Oh, go ahead, Matt. Right. So as there are questions, we have a microphone that we can move around so we can make sure that the online folks can actually hear both the questions and the answers. Okay, so let's now experiment with our slide changing exercise. Okay. The joys of Zoom. You'd think it would be easy by now, wouldn't you? Okay, so which one of yours is?
Oh, choose your own adventure.
Excellent. Okay, then we can. And to save all of you from my incessant and long-winded babbling introducing each person, I'll ask them to introduce themselves as a part of starting their presentations. Right. So Steve, I pass the torch to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Hey, flesh and blood people. Hey, online people. What's up? What's good? Steve Diggs, University of California, always now Office of the President. Many of you know me from Scripps, and so a lot of my view of the world comes from dealing with oceanographic data. Part of my new job is being product manager for Dryad, and I just want to tell you a little bit about what Dryad is. If you've heard this before, just go back to preparing your slides for your next talk. And advancing is, Daniel bails me out all the time in real life and online. Oh, like that. There we go. Cool. All right, so the question is where to publish data. As the first up speaker, I felt a responsibility to sort of set the stage for what types of repositories are we talking about, and I'm going to end up asking the same question. So we have our disciplinary repositories like Iris or BecoDemo, where people produce data, they know where these data should go. The program manager would look for them as well in these specific places. And then we have general data repositories. And these are just a few of them: Zenodo, Dataverse, Mendeley, Figshare, and then the one I deal with is Dryad in the middle, and of course, DataOne. These are general repositories, and it's just like in the name, they really do take many types of data and have responsibility to many different funding agencies. Dryad is a digital repository, and I won't read to you. It drives me crazy when people read their slides, but it does curate data for a variety of data sources across my responsibilities across all 10 campuses, but Dryad is international, and it makes the publications discoverable and freely usable and citable It's general purpose and it is a nonprofit and it is member driven, meaning that the members have a financial contribution that they make. Some of the origins, it started in 2007. It's backed by journals. So that was a new experience for me to be with a repository that has a lot more interaction with journals, a lot more responsibility to their needs. It's any parameter, any format. It's curious since it has, I can't spell license. Persistent identifiers through Easy ID. So that's another one of the portfolio that we have within UC3. Core Trust Seal, the digital preservation level. This is where it sits in terms of how UC looks at it. If you see up at the top, that's kind of how the UC people interact with the data that are in Dryad. You can see the Dryad is underpinned by Merit, which is the digital preservation layer. And then, of course, it has all the technologies behind it like Wasabi and Glacier and S3. So Dryad sits at a particular level, but the responsibilities above and below that level are somebody else. So think of a repository, I know this is foreign for some people, where you don't have to build everything yourself. This is kind of the user interface of what it looks like. You log in with your ORCID, so it's promoting the use of personal persistent identifiers, and you can see the literally hundreds of institutions that are member organizations with Dryad that use Dryad and that depend on it to satisfy both funder and publication needs. This is an example of one of the data landing pages, similar to things that I'm used to. You can see the persistent identifiers here, how many views, how do you download the data set, and then some of the other persistent identifiers of some of the contributing authors. Little history of UC3's interaction is very, very simplified. In 2012, we had this thing called Dash that was sort of an in-house product. In 2018, Daniela and John made an alliance with Dryad that brought in some money and some opportunities to chase funding. And you can see in 2019, there was a new Dryad launch. As a result, there was a sharp uptick. You can't really see it here. There's a sharp uptick in the number of data sets that got published, and it continues to grow. It's well over 50,000 data sets today. So I want to skip to the next slide first and talk a little bit about external funding because we're talking about sustainability. So one of the things in the Dryad UC3 Alliance is it brought in these opportunities to chase funding. One was in a CEF grant that's still going on as of, I believe it's 2019 through this year. So 870K, and John, my boss, is the PI. NIH is funding through the GRAY initiative, the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, which is the generalist repositories, that sort of word cloud you saw earlier of repositories are all in it. And John is the co-chair of that. And then Sloan doesn't currently provide funding, so there's private funding in it as well, but provided some resources to have a relationship with Zenodo, which Dryad does use when you archive your software. So Amber and I were talking about this not too many hours ago. How long would it take? I'm going to try to get in under what she would do. And I want us in the room to think about rethinking what is a repository. When I came along, repositories were very much tied to process studies or a particular study by NSF. No one else was going to archive the data. Every particular process study, WOS, JGOFs, go ahead and name your process study, had to spin up its own repository. That is not still necessary. I was just in a country, or I was just in Sri Lanka, where we could build what we have in the United States for pennies on the dollar. And they're totally willing to do so with very little seed money. So what repositories do we really need to sustain? Think about the purpose that those repositories serve. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And now, Amber.
Are we holding more questions for the end?
Yes, well.
Yes.
I guess we could take a question or two with each transition as it takes a moment to.
Okay.
Is that
Change.
advancing?
So we'll have two for questions during our next presentation transition.
I use the bottom.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, great.
Let it click twice.
Okay, thanks. Okay, hi. Okay, so I believe I need to introduce myself. My name is Amber Budden. I'm the AUL, the Associate University Librarian for Digital Strategies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I've been part of the DataOne leadership team for just over a decade now, and I'm also co-PI on the Arctic Data Center. But today, I'm going to be focusing on DataOne and our kind of sustainability story with the intent to provide an example for our discussions later. Nope. Nope. Okay. All right, I'll get there. Okay, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what DataOne is. I think a number of people in the room are familiar with DataOne. For those of you that aren't, just a kind of really quick summary of DataOne. DataOne is not a data repository, it's a network of data repositories. We have over 50 repositories, part of the network that are represented globally. Within DataOne, we have a lot of data, largely within Earth environmental sciences. Some other domains are represented as well. And both the size of the network and the amount of data that is exposed through DataOne is growing. And so when I say data within DataOne, I'm talking about discoverable through DataOne. These data sit within the repositories, and DataOne is a metadata catalog. It enables you to view, search, and discover the data that is held within those partner or member repositories. If you want to know more about DataOne, there's a bunch of URLs there. So what I want to do is provide a little bit of a background about how DataOne came to be, what we're about, and our funding strategy or our sustainability strategy moving forward. Okay. So back in 2009, NSF had a program called DataNet, and DataNet funded DataOne to the tune of $20 million for 5 years. This is the initial funding to DataOne in the sense of it being DataOne, but there were a lot of grants and a lot of development activity and collaboration that preceded this point in time. 2012, we actually went live, so it took a couple of years to get infrastructure that we were then making available for researchers to use. 2014, DataNet provided renewal funding to the tune of 15 million, again for another 5-year period. By 2017, we had our NSF review. NSF had always indicated that DataNet was a fixed term funding strategy and that we needed to have a sustainability plan. And so that 36-month review was really thinking about sustainability. We consulted with a sustainability expert to help us with this process. And in 2019, those NSF funds ended. At that same point in time, we were exploring a service model, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then just in 2021, we got the institutional or UCSB approval to have a DataOne income and recharge. And so this story, I'm going to focus on a couple of points in here as we go through the presentation. So in terms of what DataOne is, as I mentioned, it's a network of repositories. And at the core of that are those repositories themselves, the member nodes. Member repositories. And so here you see the timeline of 2012 through 2022 of the growth of the network, the growth of the community. We have a number of repositories that have joined DataOne since 2022, and we're preparing to do an announcement on the launch of those, and so those aren't reflected on this slide. But I wanted to highlight, as I mentioned, DataOne is not a repository, but we are a network of other repositories that are also facing sustainability challenges. And you'll see a number of these repositories are in gray, and that indicates some transition that they have gone through. And so not all repositories that started at the beginning of our journey still exist in the same shape or form at 2022, 2023, and that's the potential point for discussion. We have continued to grow the network. When we had NSF funding, the growth of the network was facilitated by that funding. We could invest developer support in onboarding repositories to the DataOne network. At this point in time, we don't have that same level of support. And so it really is a community initiative. These repositories need to put the investment in themselves in terms of developer time to join DataOne. Now, that has been facilitated by a lot of the work that we did during the NSF funding in terms of development of, for example, a generic member node stack, integration of schema.org. There's been advances that facilitate the onboarding of new repositories. DataOne is this advanced thing is really challenging. Okay, there we go. Underlying software functionality of DataOne, it's built on Medicat and Medicat UI. And as I mentioned before DataOne, there was already development activity that had been happening at NCS through Matt Jones and Matt's team. And so Medicat is a fundamental kind of infrastructure component to DataOne, and that's used by a lot of other repositories within the community as well. For example, ESS Dive and the Permafrost Discovery Gateway, Arctic Data Center, and KMB are examples of other repositories and infrastructure that leverage both Medicat and Medicat UI. And so this development contribution from other communities has enabled sustainability of DataOne. So we've had in-kind contribution through other developers. We've also had the opportunity to leverage other awards that have gone to these other activities to help support the ongoing development and maintenance of that core code. But ultimately, when we're talking about sustainability, we need to have funds associated with it. And so when we're talking about funding, and this is where that 36-month review piece comes in, when we're talking about funding, and we're talking about funding with the NSF panel, the conversations were along the lines of funding agencies. You know, that's an obvious place to go. NSF was very clear that the DataNet initiative would not be funding DataOne moving forward. But there are, of course, other agencies, foundations where you can seek support. Organizations, whether it be academic, libraries, academic institutions, other organizations, subscriber models, membership models, perhaps even the repositories themselves. That was posited as a potential, but given that repositories are struggling for money, the idea of them paying to play to be a part of the network was something that DataOne didn't think was a viable option at that point in time. Or then individuals. And so these kind of three areas, these three primary areas were considered by DataOne. It was very important to us because we are built on a network of repositories that we weren't charging for access to the data or for discovery of those data held by those repositories. We didn't want to financially benefit from the infrastructure that repositories had set up. We were working in partnership with them. At one point, we explored the potential of a paid model that provides funds back to the repositories that were part of the network. But ultimately, we moved forward with an income and recharge or a service model and introduced some new services on top of discovery that would be something that we anticipated the community would pay for. And the identification of these services was done through a number of focus groups considering the needs within the community. So DataOne Plus, this is a service that we offer that provides custom search portals for science, for data, and for data within the DataOne network. This is one of the primary services that we now offer. And the second is a hosted repository. Speaking to Steve's point, do we need more repositories? Yes, no, open for discussion, but we did work with a number of organizations that felt that they needed a way to manage their data. They wanted a repository. They didn't have the capacity or the funds to have a developer in-house. So DataOne Plus, this is a way of collating data from across the full DataOne network to be able to have your view of data. So if you're a research lab and you want to have all of your research team's data in there, if you're a field site and you want to have all of the data that have been collected at your field site by different individuals across different institutions, if you are a single researcher that wants to be able to profile your work or your research network. A lot of the functionality that exists within here has been developed in collaboration with this in-kind support, and then also through these other grants that are working with Medicat. The hosted repository, this is a method where, as I mentioned, you can benefit from the Medicat infrastructure, and you can have a repository that is specifically for the data from your institution, from your research group, whatever the unit of currency or the data are. So these are the two services that we've moved forward with to be able to maintain the DataOne network by charging for specific services that are layered on top of that functionality. So in terms of looking at this as a model, on the left-hand side, becoming a DataOne member, that's free. We want repositories to join the network. There is no charge to joining the network. There is no charge to going to DataOne and discovering data that is held by those repositories that are part of the network. If you choose to have a DataOne Plus model, or if you choose to have a hosted repository, then those are the features that we charge for. The process, and I'll let Matt speak to this later in questions if he wants to, the process of getting this income and recharge go through the university was incredibly laborious, and it resulted in these really weird numbers at the bottom. So $47.92 and $1,083.34. Not the most community user-friendly numbers to be throwing around, but that's what came out of the budget sheets. Thank you.
So while we change over to Kirsten's presentation that she's going to share her screen for, do we have any questions for Amber and Steve while we work on the changeover? Yes, Mark.
So is DataOne fully self-supported now?
We got our first credit card payment today. I just found out. We have a number of organizations and individuals that have adopted our hosted repository service and also the DataOne Plus. And so we have money starting to come in. We haven't done a significant launch just yet because we didn't have community engagement staff that we could fund to be able to do a big announcement. So we haven't officially launched it. We've been working with partners. We have money coming in. We are not yet fully sustainable, but we believe this model can get there. We just have to increase the numbers of hosted repositories and plus memberships.
Any other questions at the moment? If not, I can go ahead and pass it to Kirsten to talk about their work. Can we hear you, Kirsten?
I hope so.
Yes.
Yes, you do. Okay. Yeah, I don't have a very stable internet connection. So if anything happens, please bear with me or just skip me, whatever. So I think my contribution is slightly different. I have two use cases and wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea that was behind these use cases or the drivers, and that's why I called this sustainability through collaboration. You may know about this report came out of a workshop a few years ago from the Ecological Society of America, and two of the findings in how to make data repositories sustainable were to make the repository absolutely indispensable. And the other one is to collaborate among repositories. And I have been a big fan for collaboration to generate more sustainability and better services. I think that collaboration supports sustainability by making repositories more efficient and making them more effective in their user services. I think, and this came up just in the last talks already, do we need more repositories? I think we need to make sure we're not duplicating efforts, so we should be leveraging what we have. And we need to come together as communities and, rather than competing all for a piece of the pie, let's compete together. We can integrate services, our capabilities, and therefore make services to the users better. But another, really important aspect, I think, of collaborating for sustainability is that we will have a bigger voice when we speak together. So the two cases that I wanted to mention is the Council of Data Facilities, what many of you may be aware of, a collaboration, a network of data facilities with different operational situations, some not so sustainable, others very sustainable because of different funding venues. But they came together in an effort to share infrastructure, trying to share infrastructure which would help sustainability of those that didn't really have it. The other one is Aida, the Interdisciplinary Earth Data Alliance, which has been a collaboration of different domain-specific repositories that has been funded since 2010 by NSF. And the shared concept behind these, the shared infrastructure for the Council of Data Facilities and Aida has really been a a model built by UDAT in having common data services, common technical organizational infrastructure, then individual disciplinary curation that ensures quality of data, ensures support of disciplinary communities. They ensures the right front ends for specific data types in these communities and data products, while then also sharing tools and front ends that make cross-disciplinary searches, cross-disciplinary access of data possible. So with the two different use cases that I mentioned, the Council of Data Facilities started this shared infrastructure project, tried to come up with a roadmap, wrote a proposal for the research, for a research coordination network to dive into more detailed planning, but it ultimately did not lead anywhere. The interesting aspect of Aida is that the first 10 years of Aida worked. There was quite a number of successes. I just wanted to share that here. There was quite a broad community use and adoption, growth of data holdings, and an extension of collaborations, and really the name Aida became known as a facility, but we found a number of major challenges that led to a rebuilding of the Aida data facility with a more focused approach. I'm sorry for the phone ringing in the background. I have no way to switch it off because it's not my house I'm in. So I'm really sorry. Aida 2 now is in a new phase, as I said, and it again is a fairly broad collaboration of different repositories, different organizations, but also taking in other organizations such as the Science Education Resource Center or commercial providers, consultants, to cover all its bases with the expertise that it needs. And let me just quickly go back here. I'm sorry for the back and forth here. So in my view, sustainability can really be supported through collaboration because it helps the facilities to deliver better services to users. And this aligns with the becoming indispensable aspect of sustainability. There is less competition on the market. You work together to create a coordinated effort rather than a competing effort. What also is really important is to pool the diverse expertise of different communities and different staffing in the repositories and facilities that work together. And as we know from both Aida and another facility we've been working with, NSF is interesting to streamline management for themselves and not having to deal with a lot of individual repositories. But another aspect is also that just the operation becomes a lot more sustainable through this collaboration, that it and creates a more scalable and flexible infrastructure. This was a really important consideration for the shared infrastructure of the CDF. There is more robust risk management, providing more contingencies across a bigger pool of participants. The common procedures for software development and software maintenance make the entire facility, the infrastructure more sustainable. And an organizational structure that is set up can help minimize single points of failure that exist as well. I think this is basic. Oh, I just wanted to mention a couple of new collaborations that also bring sustainability to the different organizations. This is a collaboration of domain repositories, in this case, EarthChem, CISA, HydroShare, and to build a cyber infrastructure for the critical zone network. Again, collaboration and leveraging capabilities that provide additional funding, new grants by serving other science communities. And collaborations that also work internationally, as shown here, a collaboration between different geochemical, cosmochemical data systems that basically leverage their infrastructures and their staffing, their resources to create a more long-term and sustainable infrastructure. So my takeaway message, something that Leslie Wyburn, who is probably hanging out with you somewhere, keeps emphasizing that, you know, we should really hang together, or it's difficult to survive by yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirsten. And we may have time for a question or two as we transition to Aida and her presentation. Her presentation actually is a nice transition to our final two presentations that are more, I would say, broad-based, in that they're cross-cutting beyond individual repository or repository network examples, as they're coming from research that's been done related to multiple repositories, and then also bringing in a perspective from sponsors when it comes to repository sustainability. So a question or two. Or I think you may be ready. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. This one, hi. All right, hi, everybody. I'm Marika Virapongzi. I'm from Middle Path Eco Solutions. I am just a little bit of background. I'm a community engagement consultant, and I often work with science groups. And I'm presenting about a study that we did on sustainability of earth science data infrastructure projects. My co-authors are James Gallagher, who is around here. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. He had to be at another session, but you can also stop him and ask him questions about this. And Basil Tikoff from University of Wisconsin. And then also we had other team members who also helped us with the design of this project. So you'll see their names listed here. So we had a really great team of people to help inform the work. And the larger team helped us with developing the research design, while the core team, which were the three of the co-authors here, did most of the writing for the peer review paper and the report. So, and also I should add that it's just spacebar to transition.
Sometimes the focus is.
All right.
Looks like arrow keys will work.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. This was a project that was funded by the EarthCube office. So it was, as EarthCube was coming to an end, there was a lot of discussion about what does sustainability look like for these projects. I also want to thank the organizers for letting me just jump in at the last minute, because I saw this session on the agenda and I was like, this is the perfect place to present some of this work. And I also presented this work at the EarthCube meeting a couple of weeks ago. So the research goals that we established were, we wanted to know what projects within this earth science data infrastructure space, what were they doing and what aspects of their projects contributed to their sustainability? What type of challenges did they face with sustainability? And then also, what does it mean to be sustainable and how important is it to these projects? This is what we did. It took us a couple of years because we were all, we've got other things going on as well. But we spent a lot of time developing the design of the project. So we, of course, formed a team. We developed questions. I can share the template as well for the questions that we use, if that's something you're interested in. We got IRB exemption approval. If you've heard of that, the Institutional Review Board, if you do any kind of social science project, you need to have that type of review and approval. And then we did semi-structured interviews. They were 1 hour long. And we chose people from 11 projects, some of the projects that were already talked about today, and then probably people here who are representing these projects. So this might look familiar to you. And then we did a qualitative analysis. And so this is where that larger team was really helpful. We'd get together and just talk about what we heard. So it would be the 3 core group of us. We would do the interviews and then we'd bring the responses back and we would just talk about them and just reflect on them. And then we wrote a report for EarthCube. I'll share another slide, the link to the report. And then also we've got a peer review and process that will hopefully get published soon. So this was the sample group criteria. This is also part of that research design. We had a discussion about what type of projects did we want to really learn from? And we decided that we wanted to learn from projects that had been around for longer than 10 years. So that was kind of an arbitrary number we came up with that we thought reflected what sustainability means. We were also getting feedback from the EarthCube, coordinators who were helping to give us some feedback around, what they thought we should include in our project. And so we also considered, projects that were a little bit maybe outside of the realm of earth science data infrastructure and just try to diversify a little bit. But so these are the project sample group criteria. I also want to point out that we had some stratified sampling considerations. And what stratified sampling means is that when you have a sample group, there might be some certain criteria that we want to also make sure that we sample. So for example, we wanted to make sure that we had projects that ranged from small projects to really big projects. And so that was, and then we also had some individual sample group criteria. And what that means is the people we interviewed, we wanted to have some diversity or wanted to have a sample group that we felt was somewhat diverse and somewhat representative of the type of projects we were thinking about. We wanted to make sure the person was in a strategic leadership role. It could have been that they were a leader in the past or that they are now. And then we also wanted to make sure we were just inclusive of career stage, gender, and we also asked about if they felt that they were underrepresented in some way, just to kind of think about the breadth of where that perspective is coming from. These are the study projects that we included. A lot of these, I'm sure, are very familiar to you. And then you can just think about this in terms of what the perspective it was that they offered to the study. These are just a sampling of some of the questions we asked. There's kind of a top level categories of the types of questions. Again, I can provide this template. It was part of our EarthCube report. We included that. And in general, it was demographics about the interviewee themselves and including things like how long were you at the project? Or what career stage you're in. The relationship with the interviewee is what type of role did you have, how did you begin with the project, description of the project, kind of thinking about it as demographics of the project itself. How does the project work? And we asked them also to just focus on one project because these are people who have been involved in many different projects. And then finally, we get to the business model and sustainability. Because it was a semi-structured interview format, it meant that the questions we used were kind of guides to what we wanted to ask. And then we were able to ask more probing questions, which means that you can ask more detail and kind of go in directions that you wanted to. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure we got to the end of the interview template by the time we finished that 1 hour time slot. And then, towards the end, of course, we focused on what sustainability means, challenges. Most importantly, it was important, I think, to learn about kind of inflection points, and then also what it was that they hoped for. What was that blue skies thinking? These were some of the results. I just really included kind of top level thoughts here. And the sustainability ones, some of the things that we learned was, for example, sustainability, in some cases, people interpreted that as being sustainability of the project or the organization itself, but others really thought about it as, did we achieve our mission? Did our practices kind of live on beyond the project? Another important thing we found is that as we did this project, these subgroups of within this larger ecosystem emerged. So we saw that there were middleware kind of like software platforms. framework, which are like community-oriented types of projects, like ESIP is one of those, and database project types. And so what you might learn from that is that all of these different project groups are something, you know, it all fits within this larger ecosystem, and maybe, you know, it's something that we all need to have this ecosystem be healthy. There's a leadership evolution. This is what's interesting here is that if you look at this diagram here, you can see that, you can't see it actually, it's hidden by this talking room thing, but it says organization at the top and it says project at the bottom. And then there's research funding to the left, and then there's non-research funding. And we noticed that most of these projects began as projects, which a project is something that has a start and it has an end. And that most of them transitioned into this organization format or a business model. And that often coincided with research funding to going towards non-research funding. And it was great to hear the DataOne case study, because I think maybe it demonstrates some of this as well. There was a couple of outliers of ones that, for example, there's 5F up there, that they stayed, you know, they began as kind of organization realm, also using non-research funding. There's one that is sort of still in the realm of project and really reliant on research funding, meaning NSF funding. And we often seen as a project would evolve, they often had this leadership evolution. So there's this change in leadership where you begin with somebody maybe who it was more of a researcher, faculty member, star power, and then they transition into more of this executive director type of business minded, you know, kind of entrepreneurial type of person. And then they often had this flexible governance structure. So what that means is that there was intentional thinking about governance structure, but that would really, they needed to have that ability to evolve that governance structure as they went. And projects that weren't able to make that transition to an organization or didn't do it, they often were at risk or really, or just struggled to continue to kind of go through those project cycles. And then also that community of users really stood out in terms of the organizations that were very closely aligned to their communities seemed to be able to thrive. So being able to, for example, have maybe a community manager or be having community participation within the project seemed to help them stay aligned and also stay relevant. And then also we learned that research funding is a poor fit for projects once they become organizations. Sometimes projects would use research funding to maybe, reach out to look for, extend the innovation within their project, but it wasn't something they could really rely on. It's more of a way to get reimbursements for work you're doing and not really be able to build reserves that an organization really needs to be able to get through lean times. So that's just a short summary. These are the references and the products. I apologize for the links I've learned here. I haven't been to an in-person meeting for a while, and I've learned those QR codes are really useful. So I could have used that here. Hopefully you guys can have the slide deck because I have, so you can click on these links. There's a poster there that kind of summarizes everything. This top one here, this one has that interview template and details about our methodology, if that's something you want to look at. And then with this peer-reviewed paper, what we did is we took the report and kind of reanalyzed everything just to double check and reflect on the results more. And so I would say that this is the most updated version of the study. And that is hopefully going to be coming out soon. And then if you're looking to contact me, just the last page is just some contact information for me. I'd love to hear from you. And I'd especially just love to hear about what your thoughts are on sustainability. Thank you.
Any questions before we transition to our final presentation? Yes. And that one's going to present from
that was a terrific presentation and parallels just sort of anecdotal conversations with folks who have evolved from the research arena into the, for example, nonprofit arena. So I'm wondering the extent to which you leaned on sort of the management, either experiences or literature or culture, where I think probably a lot of these ideas have been developed a little bit more extensively.
So that's a good question. I think what you're asking is if we looked at kind of looked at the science of organizational management and literature like that. Yeah, I wouldn't say we could have gone into a lot more depth, so I agree. And that's an area I would suggest that we as a group look towards. I think there'd be a lot of answers there, but the way that we thought about the definitions of sustainability and organization project and thinking about management business models and how we categorized the results, because it took a time to kind of parse through what the results meant and how to categorize them in ways that make sense. Like, what is a business model, for example? Those things we did borrow from that domain, but I think we could have, I think we could have done more into digging into that realm.
Any others?
Okay, so our closing case study presentation is from Alan Pope at the National Science Foundation, presenting remotely. So take it away, Alan.
Great. Hopefully you can all hear me and let me know if there are any issues going along. Awesome. Hi, I'm Alan. I'll start introducing myself. I'm a program officer at NSF. I've been with NSF for almost 3 years now. I'm a temp, so I've got a few more months in this role. This is my encouragement to all of you to think of being rotators and things like that. I am a program officer for polar cyber infrastructure, so anything at the intersection of data computing and Arctic and Antarctic research. But I'm a glaciologist by training, so came to it as a researcher and through some international science coordination stuff before coming to NSF. So just trying to humanize us at NSF a little bit before diving into the rest. So actually, I'll take a step back and say the subject of this session is talking about when federal funds run dry. And so I guess I'm going to take a slightly different tack of like, well, what if they're not quite dry, and how do we think about federal funds as maybe a little bit more sustainable, where they are, and some challenges in that. So just to place myself, a lot of you are probably really familiar at working at the GEO level of NSF. The Office of Polar Programs is a part of geosciences, so we do some things on our own and some things together with GEO. In particular, basically, we support research and educational activities and initiatives across the Arctic and Antarctic, things that are about the Arctic and Antarctic and things that are best done in the Arctic and Antarctic, both research-wise and logistically. So to take a step back of like, well, why do we fund repositories? Why do we support that? Why don't we just let people do what they want to do? Well, we have an open data and code and sample management policy. You can read the full thing there, NSF 22-105. But the long and the short of it is that we require data, code, and samples to be archived in open, long-lived repositories. We share a bunch of resources with our community of how to do that, but we don't like giving our researchers unfunded mandates. And so there are some things that we'll fund on an award by award basis, but there are some things that we fund at the community level to provide that cyber infrastructure for the community. There are a lot of things that fit within that. I'll highlight a couple here. You have already heard about the Arctic Data Center today. So, and I'm not going to read these slides, but just to point out that these repositories that we fund aren't just a place to stick your data, right? Or metadata, depending on what it is. But there's a lot more there in terms of community development, training, best practices, and community management as well. In addition to the Arctic Data Center, we have our US Antarctic Program Data Center, which is more of a metadata repository. The Arctic Data Center is more on the data center and metadata center. There are some international commitments that our USAP data center has to fulfill as well. In addition, we have some disciplinary repositories like the Antarctic Meteorological Research and Data Center that gets funded centrally from the Office of Polar Programs. Some of that has to do with logistical and operational concerns. Some of it has to do with community interest in having disciplinary repositories. One of the reasons that the USAP, the US Antarctic Program Data Center, I said is more metadata, is that a lot of Antarctic researchers use discipline-specific repositories. We really encourage that. Since we're funding regional science, we say, great, put your disciplinary data in the best place possible, and then just let us know. And so that way we have an Antarctic one-stop shop to find where else that data is and have it linked together. We also support Apola Geospatial Center, so that's both data access and facilitating a collection of high-resolution satellite imagery, digital elevation models, in addition to the things like training that I mentioned before. So All of that to also say that in addition to where the data lives, cyber infrastructure is people too. We really encourage having aspects of data reuse, data management, things like that that are part of broader impacts, either part of other awards or funded on their own, both within OPP at the geo level and working with colleagues in the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. We really encourage data reuse. This is the other piece, right? Like it's not just it's not just about archiving, it's about reuse and making the most of those data that we have previously invested in, stewarding them for future reuse, both because we know exactly we're going to get their reused for, or because we don't know yet. And it's important for us to have those opportunities for new science in the future. So you can read a DCL that we have out on that a couple of years ago. I was asked to speak a little bit about cooperation at the interagency level, at the federal level. So we do work with a bunch of different federal partners to support work in the Arctic and Antarctic. It's always good to share funding burdens across different agencies. We have more resiliency on our data centers if they do have shared funding. We have this different fora, for example, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which helps facilitate connections between different federal agencies, as well as the research community, to identify shared aims and build collaboration so that we get from the just talking to the, oh, let's do something together sort of phases. In reality, aligning those timelines, priorities, and processes can be really challenging. It gets into some of the deep conversations of like, well, are you providing base funding and I'm just topping up, or are we doing this together, all the way to what's the reporting structure? The admin is both really annoying and really important at the same time. We do have mechanisms like interagency agreements or details to move money around or to move people around between different agencies to support these projects together. And we try and minimize those excess reporting requirements as much as we can. So I'll lay out a few challenges that we see from or at least from my side as a federal funder of different data repositories. We also struggle with the short-term versus long-term support. We know that we do a better job at supporting repositories if we can fund them on longer time horizons. And that's not always something that we can commit to budget-wise. At NSF, we also have the issue of continuity of management, where we have a lot of rotators, which is great. We have communication and physical exchange with the research community, but we also struggle with then having a little bit of a stop-start or sometimes changing demands on repositories, which definitely doesn't help the relationship between the NSF and the community. I mentioned before that each of these facilities that OPP supports, it's not just here's a place to store your data, it's also training, it's also facilitating reuse, those sorts of things. So what sits within like a core set of activities and is versus what's extended and additional on top of that. And that's something that's continuously being negotiated. We hear from our repositories that it is hard to hire people, sometimes hard to find that expertise and pay them what they're worth. And so that's something that we also think about is like, what are the best institutions and are they able to really support these sorts of activities? And yeah, I'll finish off by saying what a lot of you already know about length and size of awards. How do we make sure to maximize community benefit while minimizing administrative overhead? So I think that's it, but just as a reminder, there's tons more information on the NSF website, or feel free to reach out anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alan. And yes. And do we have any questions for Alan while I transition back to our introductory slides?
Hi, Alan. Mark Parsons, NASA Chief Science Data Office. So when I was running the Research Data Alliance, one of the things that I learned from other countries is that other countries' research agencies often make a distinction between research support and infrastructure support. And one of the things I've always been impressed by OPP is that you do seem to have that infrastructure support. And of course, there's the whole logistics office for particularly the Antarctic. But my question is, has OPP thought about, or is it even possible within the NSF structure, to make that sort of distinction where where research funds, the cool, exciting new stuff, but then you have an ongoing commitment to keep the infrastructure alive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's aspects even within the research side where we, for example, on the Arctic Sciences section, we distinguish between the Arctic Observing Network versus some of the other research programs where there's a general trend towards different types of awards, longer awards, but also there are, I'd say higher bars in terms of like how fast you have to share your data and things like that. On the cyber infrastructure side, it's actually something that I've been trying to encourage our research community to do, which is to think of cyber infrastructure as inherent to some of the work that we're doing, as in a lot of those community aspects of community benefits and community sharing as being part of the research, and also saying we will always fund a place to have our Arctic data. We will always fund a place to have our Antarctic data. I don't know structurally if we're there yet, but it's something where at least socially we're trying to make sure that our research community understands.
And I think that actually is a great question and answer for the transition into our discussion, as that is particularly one of the questions that we wanted to try to address here, which is one of what sustainability means from the different perspectives of folks in the room. As Alan just highlighted, trying to move towards the sustainability of the capacity to provide long-term discovery, access, and use of the data that are produced by program activities. But we've heard from a number of repositories today where, from a repository or a programmatic perspective, there is an understandable sort of programmatic or sort of local perspective that comes in terms of what is the sustainability of a particular institutional capacity and approach to being able to provide access. And those are just two examples of the types of different sort of views of the broader idea of sustainability that we'd like to open up the floor and have our conversation about. I wanted to highlight again, here's the link to our shared notes if you haven't gone there already. But then open up the floor for first a conversation about what sustainability means to you. And if you could help frame that with, just a couple of words of introduction in terms of sort of what perspective you think you're bringing to what you think about sustainability and what it means to you in terms of an ongoing impact for the research data that are being produced. So who'd like to start? Okay, thanks, Mark.
Feel obligated now. Hi, I'm Mark Cervilla, and I'm one of the principals at the Environmental Data Initiative. So I look at two ways of sustainability. I think the most obvious one and the big elephant in the room is the funding part. And so we're still always working on that, different angles on trying to continue our funding. The other view of the sustainability that I'm always tackling, though, is the infrastructure sustainability, technical debt within our infrastructure, trying to keep our systems up to date and hacker free. So, those are the two types of sustainability that I generally look at. There's probably others on our project that have a different perspective, but I'll start there.
Mark or Matt?
So Matt Mernick from NCAR. So one of the first things I worked on at NCAR in 2011 was a project called Data Conservancy, which was another NSF DataNet project similar to the DataOne, which not quite as long-lived, maybe not quite as sustained. But one of the things we did do was write a paper, which I'll mention a few bits of it. And I was mostly just transcribing what other people told me, so these weren't really my ideas, but what we talked about sustainability a little bit, and sustainability of the data curate, the data is one thing, right? So there's data, there's sustaining technologies, we just mentioned, technical stacks, there's sustainable financial structures, and there's sustainable ways of ensuring the continuity of human knowledge and skills, which is sort of the people and organizational things, right? And I think maybe part of the framing, Carl, from you was, do we need to, when we're talking about sustainability, do we need all four of them? Or, can you sustain data independently of technology or independently of an organization or through different financial structures? So I guess I would put a four-part framing on it, right, which is the data, technology, the money, and then the organization / people.
Need another microphone.
Thanks very much. Pam Collins, NASA Applied Sciences headquarters in DC. I would really stress the personnel component of the equation. I often hear discussions about finances, about infrastructure, data formats, all that other stuff. What I don't hear as much about is data librarians, people with knowledge. And quite often that gets overlooked because people move through roles. And so we try to automate and get around that. I personally don't think you can, not in what I've seen in my career. Libraries need librarians. Data systems also need librarians. I would like that to be talked about more than it is.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy Hobelhender, Knowledge Motifs, LLC. One of the things that I think is important for sustainability that's kind of underlying all of this is development of the community of users. So there's got for users change, users requirements change. As research itself is changing and as people are needing to learn different skills and so on, it's important to keep up with that assessment of what the use is of the data you're doing. And Amber mentioned this as an important part of involving community and finding ways to really focus on that. That's not only important for marketing, but also for continuing to think ahead of what the users are. So I would think that's an important part.
Well, I might toss in my 2 cents worth. Having worn many hats over 30 years of different means of engagement with preserved data, all the way from dissertation work, having come across a well-preserved single data set from a project 20 years before I needed it, to building and designing platforms for discovery, access, and reuse of data, but without a strong focus on long-term preservation, to now my work in the library, where we have absolutely that strong focus on preservation measured in decades, verging on centuries, in terms of the history of libraries and their provision of access to knowledge. I've had a very changing perspective, but that's the one where I keep coming back to as we talk about preservation and sharing and sustainability. What are we sustaining? And when we want to talk about timeframes measured in decades or beyond, we have to think about how we value that and how we build infrastructure, human capacity that can use the technical capacity that we're building to ensure that long-term access to the product and knowledge that we're really focused on. And all of us that are building repositories and developing and evolving our communities are ultimately working towards that end, recognizing that that requires change through time. So that's why as I've grasped this elephant on many sides over the years, I try to remind myself that, from that perspective, I'm currently focused on the long-term discovery, access, and reuse, while recognizing the critical role that everything else we've been talking about so far, in terms of projects that spin up capabilities, the folks that develop and maintain and support the infrastructure that's needed, the role of the data providers in the development of the metadata. Those are all absolutely critical, but always keeping in mind also that we're working towards an end goal of long-term preservation of access and reuse. So that's just my 2 bits. Others.
So I was noticing the second part of your question on there about sustainability of the repository network, and noting Kirsten's discussion of things and some maybe sense of frustration about maybe aspirations of the Council for Data Facilities and that sort of thing that maybe didn't necessarily come about. You know, and even looking at some of these use cases, I mean, it seems like everybody's kind of still trying to go it on our own. You know, we all have these problems. We all have to figure it out, you know, and I include government agencies and everything in this too. We have a different dynamic to some extent than a NSF funded project, but it's, you know, we've got a lot of the same problems that we're trying to tackle and deal with, no matter where you're coming from. And, you know, we haven't figured out yet really, I guess, how to share and share alike. You know, I mean, how do we flex up in certain areas when something's available and we need to forward migrate a whole bunch of data in a particular format so that it remains viable, and then sustain it a little bit lower cost for a while. We haven't figured out how to move resources around the whole Earth system data community in some way that can really take best advantage of where the opportunities arise. And I think that's a model that we really need to try to figure out, and we really need to try to work toward. I mean, there's no reason why we can't take the data that we need to better understand and study the Earth system and really think about it as an entire enterprise, and think about it as a loosely coupled network of all of these different pieces that need to cooperate in some way to help to move it ahead, but also compete because we need to push each other and make it better over time. So we need kind of something in there that we're not quite finding yet, I think, across the community. And I don't think we've come up with a real study to determine whether or not it's possible. I mean, right now it doesn't seem possible because we haven't done it. We've been talking about it for over a decade, at least. But somewhere in this, we need to kind of find a way to help move that ahead. And I think that's what really will make it sustainable. That's what sustainability will mean, when we can share and share alike across the community in some way.
Thanks, Guy.
And unless there's Ted?
One quick one, Doug Schuster, NCAR, and I agree with those comments, but also at what fidelity do data sets need to be preserved and shared, and for how long they lose value over time? And then at what level of service do we keep providing a highest level of service over a long time, or do we change access service levels, those types of considerations?
Ted had a
Ted Haberman, Metadata Game Changers. One thing that's I think Sky, that's a great point as usual. But one thing that Steve said about Dryad, I think is sort of critical here, because he mentioned John Chodaki and Danielle Lowenberg, who sort of led the effort by California Digital Library to contribute in a major way and sustain Dryad essentially, and it was really a thought process change at the University of California, which of course is a sort of like a big university, sort of like the big university, but they convinced University of California system that rather than building their own thing, their own repository, or continuing to support their institutional repositories or whatever they were using, they should contribute into this community thing. Sort of, I think, if I understood what you were saying, Sky, is sort of that same idea of they hoped less money. I don't know how that worked out, but they were spending less money putting it into a community thing. And it's a little bit like, I mean, it's the successful models that we heard about so far, I think Dryad and DataOne, were sort of member supported. And right now, the biggest repositories in the research community, which are Crossref and DataCite, both with tens of millions of items, are member supported as well. So I think the member support idea is one that's interesting, but the aspect of Dryad's history, this change that the University of California made, was an interesting one, I think, in terms of sustainability. And if you talk to John, I mean, about this, they made a conscious decision that that was the cost-effective way for them to, for the university system to continue to sustain data and research outputs of their researchers. So I think I'm seconding what Sky said was maybe an example of someone deciding that contributing to something was better than building their own version of it. And so anyway, seems reasonable.
Well, this is probably a good time to transition into more of that potentially blue sky perspective that we were looking at in terms of, what is the one thing that you could do or that we could do to facilitate sort of your definition, your vision of what sustainability looks like, because I think that can help lead us towards some thinking about what logical next steps would be coming out of our discussion here and broader discussion in the community. So I guess I would open up the floor for us to break out our magic wands. I didn't borrow my friend's physical magic wand that he uses for these things, but we can pretend. Yes, Matt.
Yeah, so I've been wanting to follow up on what Sky said and now what Ted said. So this fits in. Like one of the things I've always wanted to see was a lot more shared software for infrastructure that I think a lot of repositories, the ones I operated included, develop their own software for everything. I can't tell you how many metadata editors I've counted in the world. It's a lot. And it feels like many of them do much of the same thing. And I wish we could come up with a way to, where NOAA and the Arctic Data Center and EDI and Axiom and just I could make a list of like 100 different groups that all have their own metadata collection system that we could all work together on one that works well across the community instead of so many different. And I've thought a lot about why we go down this path. And I think a lot of it is tied to funding stability and the sort of this community of like, how do we sustain this stuff? It's through serial switching between grants and funding sources or being aligned with an agency. And so I feel like it's going to require quite an active will for a group of people to come together and do something like that. But that's what I'd love to wave my magic wand and have all of us working together on software systems to support our ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm Bob Wade from the Environmental Data Initiative. I just want to follow up on what you all said, because it seems to me that what we're talking about now is not a strategy for individual repositories, but a national strategy to keep all the important data that we need accessible into the future. And I don't think we can count on the government to create that strategy for us. I mean, in fact, the agencies are a little bit of the problem because of the way they dole out the money. So I think what we need to do is think about that scale of strategizing rather than the individual repositories.
And while we're waiting, I'll call up Kirsten, and I don't know if you're still online, Kirsten, but the proposal you put together for shared infrastructure to CDF and EarthCube, I thought was a great nod in that direction. I'd love to see us work on something like that again. I don't know, Kirsten, if you want to review what it was you proposed there, but I thought it was a great start. Oh, Kirsten had to leave.
She was calling in from Germany, so it was there was a bit of a time zone thing going on. Yes, Ted.
Maybe you could share what you know about that proposal, so you give us an idea of what the elements of what was it about it that made you want to talk about it?
Well, yeah, the main thing was that it was an attempt to have different repositories be able to share infrastructure where there's a shared pool of, for example, storage and other things that we all struggle with putting together. And yeah, so I thought it was a great kind of a service model that linked repositories within the Council of Data Facilities together. So I thought it was a great model. There was a coordination problem probably trying to figure out how to make it work, but. So Corinna, you were more closely involved with that, right? Do you have anything to say?
We did meet about it, like several people were there here in the room, and I think there was an overall agreement, but NSF wasn't interested in it, right? You guys wrote the proposal. Danny, you can talk about this. the white paper and stuff and it was received in days.
Yeah, so just to distinguish a little bit between aspects of government. Now, I know government can be the problem in a lot of regards, and my piece of government is not an exception to that. We're the problem a lot of times too. But I mean, there's the funding agency part of things that doles out funding to do things, and we do a little bit of that as well as the other agencies represented here. But, you know, the agencies that are operational data agencies that have a long-term responsibility for observational data of the earth and model output data and a lot of these different things. I mean, we operate under a mission that includes all kinds of mandates related to a record schedule that all of these data fall under that we deal with that says, we're going to do these things with these data over time. This is our mandate to do these things, and it's going to go on for this period of time. And that drives our sustainability. And we don't always do a great job of it. And there's a lot of stuff that falls through the cracks that should be dealt with that way that isn't. So there's a lot of problems with it. But the operational data agencies, especially in the Earth system science, NASA, NOAA, and USGS together, and USGS is chump change compared to the other two. We need to be part of the solution. We need to be part of working toward this together. And we need to be doing that in concert with the grant funded organizations and what those are producing as well. So I guess if I had to wave my magic wand, I'd put all of that together. And it is, I totally agree with you. It is a national data strategy for, you know, sustainability of the whole thing. And we have bits and pieces of that are going on right now with this chief data officer idea and that going throughout the different agencies and sort of what that's going to actually do. And we'll see how that develops over time. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved and it's not quite hitting the mark yet, but it's starting to create the seeds, I think, for something that we can develop toward, you know, that kind of a magic wand over the next 10 years.
Ted?
So I'm sort of in a different game now than this, but so when I'm listening to Sky again, you know, it seems to me that where this is happening right now is sort of the let's just call it the migration to the cloud. You know, NASA is certainly doing a lot of work. NOAA had the big data program, and that's continued in certain ways. I'm not so familiar exactly with what the USGS is doing, but data site and Crossref are both also moving to the cloud. So I guess my question is, you know, I don't know if there's someone here in a lot of those situations, the cloud means AWS. So I don't know if there's anyone here from Amazon today. But so my question is for the people that have some experience in that cloud migration effort, are we taking our silos and moving them all to different silos in a different location? Or is there some opportunity to do some unification of the infrastructure or the software or the tools in that cloud environment? It seems to me, and of course, Iris and UNAVCO, I shouldn't leave them out. You know, it seems, is that a question? I mean, that's a question for me. I don't have an answer.
Steve?
This is always a surprising conversation to me that we never start with a needs assessment. So when I got in this game, my repository was WOS, and we had it a little bit closer. Okay, thank you. When I got in this game, we had people who were champions, and they were people making measurements, and they said, we need to keep these data. So I'm going to put in an NSF grant to make a repository because no one else is going to do it. And so there was a quantification demand by people who were actually putting instruments wherever they needed to be. And we don't do that anymore. We're saying, well, we generally need to keep data, which is a very weak argument to go anywhere with. We don't say to getting back to the point, I think somebody earlier said, which data need to be kept. We haven't made that decision and say we need exabytes of data that look like this, that come from this, and this is where we need to put them somewhere. If we don't do a needs assessment, it's very hard to go back to any agency or private funder and say that you need resources to do a particular thing because we haven't defined what that thing is for the 21st century.
I work for an organization called 2I2C, and we do cloud stuff, open infrastructure. And one of the comments I wanted to make about sustainability and the infrastructure side is, even though we're a technology organization, we don't have any source code that we maintain whatsoever. Everything we do is contributed to an upstream open source project. There is no such thing as a 2I2C software package that we maintain by ourselves. And so in terms of those problems of keeping the infrastructure maintained, reducing the duplication across this ecosystem, opening opportunities for cloud things, I would encourage this group, the next project you're funding where you're like, oh, we're gonna get a developer to do something, we'll spin up one new project. Think about other projects that are out there, think about how you can turn that project into something better. It can be a little more work on the front end because you're like, oh, it's someone else's code, but the long-term benefit of solving a problem, not just for yourself, but for everybody else, helps the sustainability of the overall organization. The other thing it does is it means if you ever were to disappear, your code keeps on living, and you're not wholly responsible for maintenance of that code. Open source is more than just I make my code open and I leave it out there. Open source is a community takes responsibility and governance for it, not necessarily the organization.
Yeah, I'd respond to that. Say, I think that a lot of people in this room have been doing that for decades, and software like NetCDF that has been open source and used throughout the community is the kind of thing that everybody's trying to build on. And yet, even with that, we still have this challenge of integration. And I think there's a higher level of organization that needs to happen beyond just the individual product yeah.
Yes. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. This has been, I think, 2 minutes. Counting down. Yes. And as we want to close out the session with what we might look at as next steps, judging by the attendance for the session and the conversation we've had so far, and from folks outside of this room that I've spoken to, I think this remains of significant interest to many, if not all of us in the information and data space. And I would ask what folks think we should do as a group and as a community to try to continue to move forward on this. As we're starting to see some research products coming out. We certainly have a wealth of experience and diverse experience within the community. What can we do next to actually have an impact on this continued problem of sustainability? Any comments or suggestions? Yeah.
So I heard this, I think I heard this come up while I was taking a couple notes. There is a cluster in ESIP called Sustainable Data Management. We started after an eager proposal that went around maybe 5 years ago or so. We have a couple projects we're trying to figure out, but if you wanted to, that we're finishing up. But if you wanted to continue this discussion, that might be a good place to do it.
Right. And actually, that was one of the reasons why I was not immediately putting the reflexive response of let's create a cluster.
I wondered about that.
Because yes, there are and that cluster in particular is potentially a really good venue for continuing this conversation and potentially spinning up some additional work. Yes. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. He wanted to share something on the screen. Oh, yeah, yeah. Alan, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Maybe this is a good segue to just say, this is probably obvious to most people, but it's a lot easier for NSF to respond to community voices and community consensus than individual proposals and individual PIs. And so that community level work can definitely be funded with workshops and things like that. But it makes it a lot easier for NSF to respond when we know that there's community buy-in and community impact. So keep up that coordination work and let us know how it goes.
Other suggestions? Fortunately, this session was recorded, and we'll look at that recording to extract some key nuggets. I know the one in particular that resonated for me was Sky's observation about the sort of process of fragmentation that we, out of necessity, create through the models that we've used to historically at least initiate repositories, and Areca's results, I think bear that out in terms of, you know, the long-lived repositories may have started as projects and then continued in another form, but interestingly, they all continued largely independently, building sort of a continually growing ecosystem of repositories that individually are successful, but are they efficiently meeting our needs in the long run for that long-term discovery, preservation, and reuse? I think these are some really interesting conversations to continue, and yeah, perhaps the sustainable data management cluster could be a good place to start that. Any other closing comments or suggestions before we call it a day, or at least a session? If not, thank you very much for coming and engaging with us in what I hope is the beginning of a continuing discussion around this topic in ESIP.